Hello, and welcome to our next module. Let us all take a moment and give thanks and praise for the fact that we have been chosen to be here today. I'm sure that you all feel a great sense of gratitude given the fact that you have been chosen out of the huge mass of damned humanity to be the recipients of God's grace and election. Now, as a result of our choice, I have no doubt that we are all earnestly following God's law, both old and new, and that we are giving evidence of our election through rigorous work and evidencing the value of that work through the rewards that we receive. Now, many of you may feel some sort of a compulsion to celebrate these good things that we have received by grace, and that is to be commended. However, please remember that in your celebration you ought to simply soberly reflect on God's grace. There will be no dancing, there will be no boisterous singing. We ought to do everything in good decorum. And if anyone does become a bit too spirited, please remember that this will be seen by the elders as a sign of sin and reprobation. And on that note, then, I leave you to go about your days, evidencing your election by your rigorous hard work and adherence to the law. So, you might be thinking to yourself, what exactly on earth was that? Well, that was my very polished, very well-rehearsed efforts to imitate Calvin, or rather, I guess, more generically, a sort of Calvinist approach to thinking and to thinking about how we ought to behave as Christians. As many of you probably know, John Calvin is another one of the primary reformers, early reformers. He is probably second only to Martin Luther in terms of his influence on subsequent Protestant thinking and tradition. And so what I want to do in this module is to talk about Calvin and some other aspects of the Reformation. So in the last module we looked at Luther, who kind of really gets the ball rolling, so to speak. We're going to shift our focus now to look primarily at Calvin and then some other reformers. In terms of Calvin, one of the things that he is particularly important for is really developing a comprehensive theological system. As we said in the last module again, Luther, for all of his fieriness and his insights and his big ideas, is not really a systematic thinker. Now, Melanchthon and others shape his thought into a coherent system later. But when we move to Calvin, we have someone who is kind of almost the definition of systematic. His Institutes, which he produced multiple versions of over the course of his life, are really a systematic theological project, really centered on his particular understanding of how salvation works. In many ways, it's kind of a Reformation mirror of a Summa, like we find in Aquinas, except in this case it's centered on some Protestant principles, which we will talk about here in the coming minutes. So Calvin really gives us a very influential systematic Protestant theology that we're going to talk a little bit about. But also here in this module, after we talk about Calvin for most of it, I do also want to touch on a few other aspects of the early Reformation, and particularly looking at kind of the two extremes, if you will, when it comes to the Reformation following Luther and Calvin, who sort of, I think you could argue, fall in the middle. On the more extreme reform end of the spectrum, or really what's more often referred to as the Radical Reformation, we're going to look at some movements that take some of Luther's ideas like sola scriptura to their logical end, and basically reject all of, or almost all of, tradition and authority. These are groups like the Anabaptists and the Mennonites, early Mennonites, and other kind of more radical groups that don't have direct descendants today because they were basically squashed by the political powers of their day for being dangerous kind of fringe groups. So we'll talk a little bit about the Radical Reformation. We'll also look at, as I said, the other end of the spectrum and look at the Reformation as it happens in England and the birth of Anglicanism. And Anglicanism, at least the mainstream of it, sees itself as a much more moderate Reformation, right? They don't want to see themselves as following Luther or Calvin in a kind of radical change in theology. They see their movement as much more modest. They often describe it as sort of a third way between Catholicism and Protestantism. They would see Anglicanism really as not Protestant in the sense of Luther and Calvin, that it represents some changes and modifications when it comes to particularly understanding of authority in the church, a few theological differences, but really a great deal of continuity with Catholic theology and especially sacramental practice. And so we'll be looking at a little bit of Anglicanism as well here at the end of the module. But as I said, we're primarily going to be focusing here on the thought and work of John Calvin, and in particular his understanding of how salvation works and some of the consequences of that in his understanding of the role of the law and of good works in Christian life, which gives birth to a great deal of what we see in the Western Protestant world today, particularly groups like the Puritans, who are obviously important in American history, and kind of harkening back to our little intro there, kind of embody some of Calvin's ideas about how a Christian would behave and what would be evidence of salvation or election. So I want to turn now then to look at Calvin and to look at his main ideas. Now before we get to Calvin's theology, let me just talk to you a little bit about Calvin as a historical figure and his context. Calvin comes a little bit later than Luther. He's born in the 1500s, in 1509, and lives through 1564. So he's kind of the second generation of the Reformation, if you will. He comes originally from France and was born into a Christian family, but has a kind of conversion experience in his youth and becomes very zealous about his faith. But he fled religious persecution in France, right? So he was part of one of these early Reform communities, but the authorities in France are not pleased with this and are cracking down on the Reformation there. And so Calvin flees the Reformation in France, or the persecution of it, I should say, and he ends up in Geneva, in Switzerland. And so he arrives in Geneva in the 1530s, 1536, and he writes his first edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion there in 1536. And he continues to expand and revise the Institutes really through the remainder of his life. In addition to the Institutes, he wrote commentaries on the Bible as a whole, basically, on all the different books of the Bible. And those commentaries are very influential, together with the Institutes. He also gains political or secular authority in Geneva in 1541. But his relationship with the political authorities kind of goes up and down through the remainder of his life. At times, he kind of has firm political or secular authority. At other times, he doesn't. But his theological impact remains consistent, and he keeps working on those institutes, and he has a huge influence throughout the Reformation beyond his more immediate influence, which includes political influence in Geneva. Now, as I said before, when we look at Calvin, he has a very different personality than we find in Martin Luther. Calvin is a very systematic, serious, austere, and a detailed thinker, kind of the polar opposite of the fiery Martin Luther. But like Luther, he really centers his thought in the area of soteriology. So really, Calvin The center of his thought is his understanding of sin and grace and salvation and how those things work. And he takes this Augustinian idea, which is also picked up by Luther, of horrific effects of original sin necessitating very concerted divine grace reaching down and sort of picking us up, if you will. He sees that as the center of his thought and really develops a systematic account of how election or predestination would work and what all of the ramifications of that idea might be. So really his thought gets kind of built out from that center, if you will. Now again, differing a bit from Luther, there is no Calvinist church per se. Right? There is a Lutheran church. There are a number of different Lutheran denominations or national churches throughout Europe, but we don't find that with Calvin. However, there are lots of different churches who would call themselves Reformed, which would harken back to Calvin as sort of their founding figure or their primary influence in terms of their theology. So the Reformed tradition in Protestant theology can be traced back, at least in the main part, to Calvin and his thought. One of the other things that takes place in kind of the subsequent tradition is there's a running battle between Calvinism on the one hand and Arminianism on the other. Right? So one of the big running theological disputes in the Protestant world is between these two sides, in particular again on this topic of election. So we're going to talk about Calvin's understanding of predestination here in a moment, but Calvinists, or the Reformed, kind of champion Calvin's view of predestination, but it is not universally popular, obviously, in the Protestant world. And so Arminianism is a movement kind of responding to and rejecting Calvin's ideas of predestination and emphasizing the possibility of human beings responding to God's grace on their own, or rejecting this idea that everything is determined by divine election. And as I said, finally, when Calvin's, in his lifetime, he has a mixed relationship with political authorities. And that, again, continues through the Reformed movement, right? If you think, for example, about the Puritans, or you think about like Cromwell in England, which he certainly has some Reformed tendencies as well. And at times, this works well. The political authorities are happy to have people who are very focused on following the law and working hard. At other times, these rigorous Reformed Christians can be very critical of the government and can really fall out of favor with the political authorities. So again, that's part of Calvin's experience that echoes down through the Reformed tradition, really up to even our own day. So again, you can find out much more about Calvin, both in your textbook and again in any number of biographies that there might be about Calvin, although I'm not sure there's a movie about Calvin. I'd have to look into that. But again, I think that reflects the differences in personalities, right? That Luther's life lends itself to a movie. He has this kind of fiery personality which plays itself out in all kinds of dramatic moments in his life. Calvin's life is much more somber and serious and might not make really the most compelling viewing if you were to try to put it into film. I'm sure it's probably been done, but certainly not the number of times that Luther's been dramatized, and it certainly wouldn't be the same sort of kind of entertaining spectacle that Luther's life might be. But leaving Calvin's film career aside, let's turn now then and take a look at this key aspect of his thought, Calvin's soteriology and his understanding of predestination. Personally, I've always found it a little amusing that Calvin, someone who is, I think, arguably the most austere, somber, serious figure in Christian tradition. If he's not the most austere, he's got to be right up there in the top 2 or 3. We have this very serious, somber individual, and his thought, and the key element of his thought, his understanding of election and grace and salvation, is summarized with an acronym of TULIP, right? So this kind of whimsical, colorful flower is used as an acronym for spelling out the various components of Calvin's very austere, serious, stark account of how salvation works. But still, you know, there we have it. I just picture Calvin, you know, kind of wearing a tulip-colored tie-dyed shirt or something. It's just incongruous. But there we have it. So TULIP is the acronym that is typically used to kind of break Calvin's thought about salvation into 5 components, and that we can use those 5 components to really kind of get the key aspects of his understanding of salvation and predestination. And just so you know, right, within the Reformed world, these 5 points are used as a kind of shorthand for talking about how much of Calvin's thought that one agrees with, or what aspects of it you might differ on. So people will say, well, I'm a 4-pointer, or I'm a 5-pointer, or I'm a 3-pointer. Not too many people get much below that, because then you stop really being Calvinist in a meaningful sense. But there's a lot of people who would say, you know, for example, that they're a 4-pointer. And so then the follow-up conversation is, well, which of the points don't you accept? So for example, in my own experience, kind of in my high school days, once I was old enough to really kind of understand the theological tradition I was raised in and kind of make my own judgments about it, at least initially, I saw myself as a 4-pointer, right? That I agreed with all of the points we're going to spell out here, except for one, namely limited atonement. And again, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but most of the time, if you run into a Calvinist who's a 4-pointer, limited atonement is the one that most people disagree with. But we'll get to that here in a few minutes. So we use this acronym of TULIP to kind of work through Calvin's account of how salvation works, centered around this idea of predestination or election that we've seen before, right? We saw this in Augustine. We've seen it in Luther, but Luther never really develops it into a systematic account of how the process works. Whereas in Calvin, it's spelled out in really painstaking detail in the Institutes and elsewhere. All right, so let's start then, running through our acronym, if we will. So TULIP obviously starts with T, and T stands for total depravity. So what does total depravity mean? Well, we've talked about this one before, and this is again reminiscent of Augustine and Luther. So Calvin would say that human nature is completely depraved due to original sin and is incapable of doing any good on its own. Every action apart from grace is sinful. Right, so again, reminiscent of Augustine and Luther here. Because of original sin, all human beings are totally and completely spiritually dead. Again, as Luther memorably symbolized it, human beings are essentially a pile of dung, right? That there's no good, whatever spark being created in the image of God might have conveyed to human beings, that spark has been completely and totally obscured by the effects of original sin. So we are totally depraved, totally dead in our sins. Which leads us then to the next point in our acronym, U, which stands for unconditional grace. Well, what does this mean? Well, God chooses to extend grace to some based only on his own will. Predestination to salvation is not based on any foreseen merit or any preparatory work. Right? So when God looks out on the sea of humanity, if you will, which in Calvin's view is going to be kind of a giant sea of a cesspool. It's going to be a giant field of dunghills, right? That all human beings, when God looks out and surveys humanity, are going to be totally depraved, totally corrupt. Now, given that, if he's going to choose some to receive grace, if he's going to choose some to be elect to salvation, obviously it's not going to be based on anything that those different human beings do. It's not going to be based on on any works that they do or any particular positive qualities that they might have. Right? They're all just completely and totally depraved. And again, remember, they can't do anything good prior to receiving grace. So there's no kind of yearning for God that some people might have within them that elicits from God then the choice of that person to receive His grace. Right? It is just completely a matter of God's inscrutable will that He picks some individuals out to receive grace and be saved, and doesn't pick others. We can't understand why He does this. It's not based on anything about any of the people chosen. It simply is because God willed it. And again, you can kind of get a sense here of a voluntarist idea underlying this. Right? This is not based on nature. It's not based on God's understanding of the nature that He's created. Everything boils down to ultimately God's will. God's choice is the final criteria for who is chosen and who is not. Alright, so we're going to take then the next step on down the road to L. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, this is the one that raises questions for even many people who generally accept Calvin's system. L stands for limited atonement. Right? This means that Christ only died for the elect. Given that God has known from eternity who the elect are, there'd be no reason for Christ to die for the sins of the damned. And here, right, we can see again the way the system is working itself out. And this is not, right, what we would see, for example, in Luther. Right? He's not going to go through this process of putting all the pieces together to make out a coherent system that has a kind of internal relentless logic, if you will. But in Calvin, he does precisely this, right? So if we think of humanity as this vast pool of dunghills, of totally depraved individuals, that from eternity, before any creation has even begun to happen, he knows which individuals he is going to elect for salvation. So, when Christ comes and dies for the sins, when He pays for this horrible sinfulness that we all have, why would He pay for the sins of those who He knows are eternally damned? Right? And in Calvin, it's not just that certain people have been elected to receive grace. Right? This doesn't come out directly in the acronym. But in Calvin's writing about this, Calvin will say, look, God has chosen certain people to receive grace, to be elect, and He has elected others for damnation. Right? So Calvin takes that step that Augustine never explicitly takes and says that God has chosen those who aren't elected to grace to be damned. Right? And if that's the case, why would Christ die for their sins? Right? Why would you build up this store of merit, if you will, if you know it's never going to be used? It wouldn't make any sense, right? God wouldn't do it because it would be pointless given Calvin's system. So he will say, look, God only died, Jesus only dies for the elect. The atonement is only for those that God foreknew would benefit from it. Now again, as I said, personally, I was never able to kind of take the step to embrace this. Even when I was within the Reformed tradition, this seemed like a case of following Calvin's logic in a way that seemed to run contrary to, for example, Scripture, right? So most obviously, we have the case of John 3:16, for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, right? World there does not refer just to the elect. It says world, right? It is referring to humanity as a whole. And so when I was Reformed, this one seemed like going a bit too far and taking Calvin's logic ahead of the testimony of the Bible. But there are those who would say, well, we can, yes, John 3:16, but there are these other passages that would say God came for, the lost sheep of Israel, and understand that in a metaphorical sense of God came specifically for those who are lost, who are part of, for example, Israel in the sense of God's chosen people. And there are other passages they would point to. I still think at the end of the day, this does not have a whole lot of scriptural evidence for it, but it is part of Calvin's system as he works out the logic of it. All right then, moving on down to the next point in our acronym, we move to I, right? And I stands for irresistible grace. What does this mean? Well, if God elects someone to receive grace and salvation, they will necessarily accept it. It is God who causes the faith, so if he extends grace, he will cause its acceptance. Right? So, again, this is an idea kind of spelled out maybe a bit more explicitly, but it is there in Augustine. Right? That if God is going to be extending grace to someone who's elect, God is also at work within them, kind of causing them to accept that grace and to respond with faith. So that even our acceptance of God's offer of grace is not our own effort. It is God working in us to cause us to accept it, right? So once God chooses you, when he looks at that sea of humanity before any salvation history takes place, and he picks out certain individuals to be elect, from that moment on, it is guaranteed that they will be saved, because God is the one who's going to extend the grace to them and also work from within them to respond to that grace and accept it, and therefore they are going to be saved. And finally, moving to the last letter, P, we know that once a person has been chosen and once God works in them to receive that grace, they are going to be ultimately saved. They are going to be with God in eternity, because P stands for perseverance of the saints. Since salvation is based solely on God's predestined grace, it's not possible to lose one's salvation or grace. Those who appear to do so were never fully or truly elect. Right? So, again, if you think about the logic of Calvin's system, this makes sense. And again, this is something you find very similarly in Augustine's later work. Right? That if God is the one working in us to accept grace, to have faith, to do good works as a consequence of that, then there's no way that we can lose that, right? Because it was never any part of our own effort or action in the first place. It's always God working in us. So God, once he's chosen, is not going to change his mind and not choose us anymore. God's choice from eternity is unchangeable. And so there's no way we could lose our salvation, because our efforts, our activity has nothing to do with the process. It's entirely God working in us. So if you've been chosen, if you have received initial grace, you are going to be in heaven. There's no possibility of mortal sin and the loss of salvation. Right? Because again, that implies that somehow it is our choice, it is our agreement to cooperate with grace or to reject that grace that plays a part in our salvation, and Calvin has none of that. Now, he will say, right, that there are people who appear to have an initial conversion, but who then fall into serious sin and obviously live very sinful lives. But he would say this isn't a case of somebody having been elected and received grace, but then losing it. He would say that they never truly received it in the first place. That the initial grace, this was just on the surface to begin with. That they were never truly elect by God. And again, this is something that you can see in Augustine. Augustine would put it in terms of some people are elect to initial grace, but not predestined for perseverance in salvation. Calvin doesn't make that kind of a distinction. He would simply say this person was never truly elect, was never truly predestined in the first place. But anyway, that is tulip, right? Total depravity, unconditional grace, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. And those 5 points really kind of encapsulate Calvin's understanding of how salvation works, which is entirely God's work, entirely predestined even before creation. Worked out much more systematically than we find in Luther, and even more systematically than we find in Augustine. And so this understanding of salvation, as we've seen in these other figures, is going to have all kinds of repercussions on other aspects of his thought and on his understanding of Christian life as a whole. So to talk a little about that, let's turn now to look at Calvin's understanding of covenants. Now, a few minutes ago I said it was sort of ironic that Calvin's very austere, stark view of sin and salvation was known for generations of at least English speakers by this acronym of TULIP, the colorful flower. I think there's a kind of similar irony when we move from Calvin's account of salvation to his understanding of covenants and works. Because really at the heart of Calvin's understanding of salvation is this basic idea that God does everything, right? On account of humanity's total depravity, total corruption by original sin, God does everything. He chooses who will be elect, He extends the grace to them, He reaches within them, so to speak, and causes them to accept the grace, and then continues to work in them throughout their lives to maintain that grace and to ultimately bring them to heaven and their eternal reward. So you have this vision of God really doing everything, and human efforts having no role to play whatsoever in salvation, or even in a Christian life, at least in terms of us doing things. But you take that and then you look at Calvin's the Christian life that he actually produces from his system of thought, and you find it seems the exact opposite, right? That Reformed Christianity and Calvinism is really the brains behind things like the Puritans that we know from early American history, right? And we have this vision of these very somber, very serious Christians who are very focused on following the law, right? Following both civil law, but even more importantly, following biblical law. Right? And we have all these stories from early Christianity and things, novels like The Scarlet Letter, where we get these accounts of people who are very focused on making sure that all of the biblical commands are followed. We also have accounts, as I alluded to at the beginning of the module, of the way that Calvin ran the city of Geneva when he had political authority, or when he had influence over the political authorities, right? That there was a great deal of attention applied to producing good works in the lives of the citizens, right? So they really went out of their way to make sure they avoided any opportunities for sinful behavior. Parties and loud music and dancing, all these things are kind of forbidden. And there's a real focus on making sure that the law is followed, right? And of course, famously, as you probably all heard at one point or another, Calvin rejects religious imagery almost entirely, right? If you go to Europe and visit all the beautiful churches and cathedrals there, and then you get to Geneva, if you go to Calvin's church, you will find a very austere church, right? It's all just black and white. There's no ornamentation, there's not pictures. It's very simple, very austere. And again, they would see this as following the Old Testament commandments against images. And they see Catholicism and all of its statues and images and icons as being contrary to biblical commands. But it is ironic, right, to have this focus on salvation where human efforts have no part to play, but then in actual Christian lives of Reformed Christians, we find a great deal of focus on following the biblical commands and covenants. Well, why is that? Well, this is where we get to Calvin's understanding of covenants and divine sovereignty, right? That if you trace everything back, ultimately, as I said before, it all comes back to God's will, to God's absolute rule or God's sovereignty, right? And Calvin wants to do everything he can to affirm and honor God's absolute sovereignty over all of creation. And as a result of that, he very much focuses on this idea of covenants, right? That God has made particular covenants with humanity throughout biblical history. And again, this is an idea that echoes through later Protestant thinking with things like dispensationalism, this idea that we can look at specific periods in salvation history or biblical history, and that God has special covenants or dispensations at different times. So with Adam and Eve, he has a particular deal, and then with Noah, things change a bit, and then with Abraham and Moses and David, and on through this, right? And this idea is in Calvin, right? That God relates to human beings through covenants. Now, there's obviously the covenant that we have through Christ, which is this free grace that we receive because God has elected us, and that God is really working in us. But for him, for Calvin, he will say, look, the old covenant is still a divinely given covenant, right? That when God gave the Old Testament law, it was an accurate depiction of how God wanted human beings to live. Of course, he's going to do away with sort of the ritual aspects that he would interpret, following most Christianity, as being kind of a symbolic preparation for what would be completed in Christ. So the sacrifices of animals aren't going to be there. That was foreshadowing Christ's sacrifice on the cross. But when it comes to the kind of the moral principles of the Old Testament or the Old Covenant, Calvin is still going to see those as very much depicting for us God's will. And so, if we have received grace, if God has chosen to work in us and bring us to salvation, and he's the one doing the good works in us, well, what good works are we going to find God doing in those who are truly Christian? Well, we're going to find God doing works within them that reflect the will that he showed to us in the Old Covenant. Right? So, if it's really God working in the elect, he's going to act in a way that's consistent with the covenant he gave us in the Old Testament. That hopefully makes sense, right? That if God is really working in us, he's going to work in the way that we know God wants people to work. So, right, what does this mean? Well, when we see someone who's elect, they're going to obviously live out the Ten Commandments, right? Because if God is in them working to do good things in them, they're not going to be lying, they're not going to be dishonoring their parents, they're not going to be committing adultery, certainly, or murder. So they're going to be doing things in keeping with the law. But they're also going to be doing things in keeping with the law in a broader sense. Now again, not the Jewish ritual per se, but following kind of all of the moral principles given to us in the Old Testament, and also, of course, in the New Testament. Another aspect of this, right, that you'll see in Calvin's thought, and especially in kind of the way his thought is taken up and developed by the tradition, right? If we look at the Old Testament, if we look at the Old Covenant, what happens when people follow it, right? What happens when people live according to these moral guidelines and do what it is that God wants them to do? Well, what happens? Well, you look at somebody like Jacob, right? What happens to Jacob when he goes off and works for his future father-in-law and does God's will? Well, what happens is his flocks multiply. He ends up being very wealthy. Same thing happened with Abraham. The same thing obviously happened with Job. It happens with Solomon and with David, right? That when you do God's will, you will be rewarded, right? And you will see this in terms of material prosperity. And this idea gets taken up in Calvin's thought and in the subsequent tradition. And a lot of people would argue that this is, in some ways at least, the basis for the traditional Protestant work ethic, right? The idea is that if God is working in you to do good things, you're going to work hard, you're going to follow the moral laws, you're not going to be wasting your time out singing and dancing in the streets, you're going to be going to bed early, getting up early, working hard, and what are going to be the consequences of that? Well, you're going to succeed, right? You're going to enjoy prosperity, both because God is going to be blessing you, but also if you just think about it, right, more often than not, people who live this way are in fact going to succeed in terms of material prosperity much more so than average, right? Because of this real focus on doing what is right and avoiding frivolous behavior, you're going to end up with people who tend to succeed. Now, again, I think you could argue that this is a fairly selective reading of the Old Testament, right? In the Old Testament, and certainly in the New Testament, right, we find as well the idea of enjoying life, right? That there are festivals, that there are feasts. That doesn't get picked up so much by Calvin, but this idea of if you are elect, God is going to work this way in you certainly does get picked up. Now, Calvin will say, of course, that it's God who's doing these things in you. And to the extent that, right, for Augustine, for Calvin, for anybody who believes this, right, it's always hard. We can admit that it's God who's really doing this stuff in us. But when we think about it, when we go through our daily lives, we can't help but think that I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. And to the extent that we think that way, Calvin is going to say, look, you don't do good works in order certainly to earn your salvation or as part of your salvation. We do the good works out of thankfulness. We do them as evidence of the fact that God has chosen us, or out of obedience and thanks to God. That's where these good works come from. That's why we do the good works. Now, of course, again, that's not really what Calvin would say is ultimately going on. What's ultimately going on is God working in us. Of course, the paradox here, right, is that when it actually comes to people living out this belief system, how is this going to work? And in many cases, what we find, right, is if you're raised in this environment, if you're taught this, how are you going to respond? Well, you're going to respond by saying, hey, if I'm really elect, if I'm going to be in heaven, that's going to evidence itself in good works and in following the law, and subsequent to that, the rewards of prosperity. So what am I going to do? Well, look, I'm going to do the good works and work hard and aim for the prosperity as a way of evidencing the fact that I've been elect. And so it certainly can, at least, maybe if not in every case, but in many cases, what this is going to do is produce people who are very focused on doing lots of works, not to earn their salvation, but to give evidence of their election. And so you can end up with people who have a very kind of works righteousness approach to the Christian life, which is, of course, ironically, the exact thing that Calvin is seeking to avoid. But anyways, we'll leave that for now, but that's just an explanation of how you get this paradoxical situation of a soteriology that's entirely focused on God's grace and God's work, but then when it's lived out, you actually see the Protestant work ethic and a real focus on good works in the Reformed tradition. Now, before we leave Calvin, I do want to briefly at least touch on his understanding of the sacraments. We talked about this with Luther, and we talked a little bit about Calvin's view in discussing Luther. So I just wanted to round out that discussion a little bit here before we move on to the two ends or two extremes of the Reformation. As I said in the last module, Calvin really represents, when it comes to the sacraments, sort of a middle position between Luther, who really maintains a fair bit of sort of a Catholic understanding of the sacraments, particularly with something like the Eucharist, where he has his idea of consubstantiation. And then, so Calvin is between that and, say, what we would see as a more stereotypical Protestant view, at least in America, kind of Zwingli's position of it's purely symbolic, right? That there's no particular presence of Christ in the bread and wine, that these things are just symbols used to reinforce what we believe, kind of through the symbolic actions of the Lord's Supper or communion. So Calvin, as I said, is kind of in the middle, right? So he doesn't accept Luther's idea of a real physical presence. On the other hand, he thinks there's more going on here than just a symbolic action. So he says that there is a real spiritual presence in the Eucharist. So we should have the Eucharist, right? He's going to say that because, look, it's biblical. It's part of the covenant that we are given in the New Testament. And there is a real spiritual presence there, but not a physical one. And so obviously, he's not going to have anything to do with something like Eucharistic adoration, which would not make any sense, given that it's just a spiritual presence there. And also, interestingly, in baptism, he's going to maintain this as well, and he's going to maintain infant baptism. And so this is sort of interesting. There's a lot of Calvinist thinking and a lot of evangelical Christianity, or Reformed thinking. But we also get mixed there some of this more extreme Reformation, like the Anabaptists and the Baptists, who reject infant baptism. But if you go to a real kind of traditional Reformed church, they will practice infant baptism. Now, what's going on here? Why does this happen? Well, it's not a Catholic view of baptism. It's not as if the sacrament itself is kind of washing away sin and transforming this person's nature. Calvin will see baptism as basically entry into the covenant, right? That with this idea of the covenant being the relationship between God and man, in baptism, the infant enters into that covenant. Now, once they are of age, they will continue in that covenant by believing, if God has elected them to do so. But he's going to say they can go ahead and start participating. They can enter into the covenant through infant baptism. And so, interestingly, he's going to keep infant baptism in his system, even though in a lot of the Protestant Christian world we see around us today that's influenced by Calvin, they ultimately do away with infant baptism. And that comes from these other movements we're going to look at here in a minute. So again, that's just kind of a basic overview of Calvin's thought. We spent most of our time, obviously, on running through Tulip, because that's really the center of his thought. And then also his understanding of the covenants and works. And then his understanding of the sacraments, I think, simply follows from that central idea of predestination and salvation in his thought. But again, there's a lot more that you can find about Calvin's thinking in the Institutes and many other places. But for now, what I want to do is to turn to these other two extremes of the Reformation, the Radical Reformation, and then also the Anglican Reformation.